Good morning friends, welcome to the point. In this video we will understand a very common problem that is faced by most of the economies of the world, that is fiscal deficit. Now starting with the definition as to what fiscal deficit is, it is the gap between the government's expenditure requirements and the receipts. So fiscal deficit gives us the difference between the money that is incoming to the government and that is outgoing from the government. So a difference of government's expenditure in an year and the receipts which the government is receiving in an year, that is usually a period of 1 year, or we say financial year. This equals the money the government needs to borrow during the year. A surplus arises if the receipts are more than expenditure. That's very basic. If your receipts, what that means, whatever the money is inflow, or say inflow is greater than outflow, then definitely you are in the surplus. And when your outflow exceeds your inflow, then you are in a deficit, as we are studying here, that is the fiscal deficit. Now what this line means, that this equals the money the government needs to borrow during the year. Yes, I'll tell you how it works is, let's suppose government's expenditure is rupees 100 and only part of it, that is say let's suppose rupees 70 can be recovered by the inflow that the government is receiving. So what is remaining is this 30. Now this 30 has to be repaid by the government, because this 30 has been definitely arranged by the government or spent it somewhere, and this spending has been done by way of borrowing it from some party. So now this 30, what it represents is the borrowing needs of the government, as the government needs to borrow this 30 rupees and pay it back to whomsoever it has taken from. So as it is written, this equals the money the government needs to borrow during an year. So as I explained, I'll explain it again. 100 is government expenditure in a year and 70 is what it can recover through its inflow or the receipts. The remaining amount is 30, and now this 30 the government has to fulfill. And how it will fulfill? It will borrow money, and from where it will borrow? It can borrow externally or internally. External source of borrowing is World Bank and IMF and the other banks of the world, and internally what government can do is either they issue government securities or it prints new currency. Now this currency thing is the last resort that the government takes. Usually it does not follow this route. The most followed or the preferred way of raising money by the government internally is issuing government securities, dated securities, state development loan, which comes under the broad ambit of government securities. So I hope you are clear with what fiscal deficit denotes and how it is calculated. We will just quickly look into the formula of fiscal deficit as the total expenditure that the government is doing in a year. Out of that we are subtracting the revenue receipts, and also we are subtracting non-debt creating capital receipts. So usually what capital receipts are in the form of, they usually create debt on the person or the government whosoever receives the capital receipts. Let's suppose I have taken a loan of 300 million US from Asian Development Bank. Now this 300 US dollars is a capital receipts for us, but at the same time it is creating a debt for us because it's a loan and then we have to repay it, right? But there are certain capital receipts which does not create debt on us, and they are called non-debt creating capital receipts. For an example, let's suppose we have got a grant from World Bank or any other international institution, and this grant is something, a one-time flow, and it's a unilateral flow, and we do not have to repay it, and it does not create a debt on us. So that is why it is called non-debt creating capital receipts. So out of the total expenditure, we are reducing the revenue receipts that the government is earning, like the taxes in a year, and also we are subtracting non-debt creating capital receipts. The amount that comes out is fiscal deficit, showing the money that government needs to borrow during a year. Moving to the next slide is the reason why this fiscal deficit arises. Is first that there is increase in the capital expenditure of the government. For example, the government is spending recklessly on infra development like roads, bridges. Now what is this? This all constitutes as capital expenditure. So all of a sudden there is increase in capital expenditure, so it leads to this fiscal deficit. There is reduction in revenue receipts. Let's suppose the revenue receipts which you were receiving last year has been drastically reduced. So how it will cover the expenditure that the government is doing? So if there is a reduction in revenue receipts, then it leads to fiscal deficit. Even if your expenditure remains constant, let's suppose we took 100 as an example in the previous slide, that 100 is what government is spending in an year, and your receipts are 70. Now all of a sudden your revenue receipts goes down to 60. Now the outcome is 40. Earlier where your fiscal deficit was 30, now it has increased and moved up to 40, and the reason is that the revenue receipts collection is low. The last point is increase in revenue deficit. Now what is revenue deficit? It is the difference between the revenue expenditure and the revenue receipts. So if there is increase in this revenue deficit, this would certainly lead to increase in the fiscal deficit of the country. Now moving on to the next slide, that is the components of fiscal deficit as to what all constitutes the fiscal deficit. So there are basically two parts. There is income and there is expenditure. Out of income, there could be a tax revenue and there are non-tax revenue of the government. So the total income generated by the government can be divided into tax revenue and there is non-tax revenue. So in this tax revenue, it is GST, customs, corporate tax, there is dividend tax that is collected. So all this constitutes tax revenue. What is non-tax revenue? Anything collected beyond the tax revenue is non-tax revenue, which is dividends, profits, interest receipts. Let's suppose government has given loan to a foreign government and receiving an interest on it, so that is interest income, and that comes under non-tax revenue. The other component of fiscal deficit is the expenditure, which is the major and the main part of the fiscal deficit. This includes the capital expenditure, revenue expenditure, grants for capital asset creation, and interest payment. Interest payment on the loan which we have taken. Here in the income, we were getting the interest. Now definitely or certainly a government takes loan from the foreign government or from internally, so they have to pay interest on it. So the interest payment that it makes comes under the expenditure. Grants given for capital asset creation. If the government is giving grants for creating capital asset in any village or any state, that comes under expenditure. The capital expenditure, as I told, that is infrastructure development, creating roads and defense equipments, and the revenue expenditure, that is salary of the government employees. So that all comes under revenue expenditure. Moving on to the next slide, that is how is fiscal deficit financed? How do we finance the amount or the gap that comes in due to the expenditure or collection of less revenue receipts? So basically there are two sources to finance the fiscal deficit. One is the borrowings and the other is deficit financing. Now what is this borrowing? That is we are borrowing money. So there are two sources to borrow money. One is internally and the other is external sources. Internal, it could be from commercial bank or issuing government securities, also called GSECs, and the external sources are like IMF, World Bank, or from government of other countries. The next point is deficit financing. Now this deficit financing means that you are printing new currency in the country to finance the deficit. So comes the term deficit financing, or borrowing funds from RBI against its security. So for that, RBI prints new currency. The government meets the fiscal deficit by borrowing. So it can be said that total borrowing requirement of a government in an year is equal to the fiscal deficit of the year, as I have explained you earlier with an example. Now move to the next slide. Also one question that arises here is that is high fiscal deficit always a bad sign for an economy? You really need to ponder on it. Now the obvious answer that comes out is that yes, it's a bad sign for an economy, but I would like to tell you that a high fiscal deficit or a fiscal deficit is not always bad for economy. If the amount expended or spended by the government is going for a useful purpose or is leading to capital creation for the country, which would in long time reap benefits for the country, then fiscal deficit is not at all a bad sign. Though it should not exceed the limits, it should always be in certain limits, but a fiscal deficit is not necessarily a negative sign for an economy. That thing has to be really clear with you all people. Now we are gonna analyze the trends of the fiscal deficit. Now this blue line tells us the going trend of the fiscal deficit as a part of GDP. If you see from last 10 years, it has been declining. You can see the trend from 2010. It has been on the constant declining mode. If you say here it was constant, but then yes, more or less it is declining in last 10 years. So if somebody asks you that what was the trend of fiscal deficit in last 1 decade, then it is constantly declining. So my dear friends, I hope it is clear as to what fiscal deficit is. It arises because the government is spending more than what it is earning. This is the very basic definition which you can remember, that government is spending more. That is why the fiscal deficit is arising. Then the components of it. So there are two components. There is income and expenditure. Out of income there is tax, income from taxes, and the non-tax incomes. Expenditure are of several types. Then how do we finance it? Either we borrow or we do the deficit financing, that is by printing new currency. And last but not the least is the trend, that it has been constantly declining from last 10 years. In between it has also remained constant, but moreover it has declined. So now this is all for the today's video. Thank you much my friends. Stay at home, stay fit. Goodbye.